So why don't we get going? I just, first of all, I want to welcome everybody. I appreciate folks who want to come and hear more about this topic. I think metrics generally is always a complicated, you want it to be simple, but it never is, right? So metrics is one of those topics. And I think Joel Bancroft-Connors, who's one of our principal consultants here at Applied Frameworks and a certified team coach and a certified Scrum trainer. I think in both in your consulting and in the training you do, Joel, I know that metrics is a conversation that comes up frequently. So I appreciate that you've put together this for today. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you, Laura. I'm looking forward to this. Back in June of 2020, we actually did another metrics webinar. That one was around another one of our articles, and it's around the responsible uses. It was good practices around metrics. We talked about what are the things you actually use at the team level. We didn't go into it then. So Laura and I felt it was high time to come back to this topic and talk about the step down into that. I want to start though with a couple of interactive things here. So first off, if you want to fire up menti.com and use that code 16517226, we're going to do two different Menti polls here real quick to create a word cloud. We'll include that final word cloud in the deck when we post it for you all.
All right, I'll put this in the chat as well.
Yep.
So it's
and hopefully that's one of those ones where I always go, okay, so let's see.
All right, so in the chat, we've got menti.com, and then we have the code, which is 165172226.
Yeah, and I'm hoping it works. I'm looking at the actual Menti, and I'm not seeing any data. Well, oh, shoot. No, that's the correct one. All right. If you all can use chat, has anybody tried to enter something yet? Question is different than the one on the screen. Okay, yeah, wonderful. It got messed up. Okay. I tried to do two of these, and so we're actually, let's go. So let's no. So somehow the same question for both. Oh, well, we'll only do one of these Menti polls. So you need to double your velocity. What's the fastest way to do that? Hire more developers, remove dependencies, limit WIP. Smaller stories, point inflation. So as we see
that other question about like what are the metrics that people are measuring, I mean, I'm actually curious. We can even have people popping into chat, but if you flip back to the other one.
Yeah, we'll do that in a second. So on this one, what I love here is there are a couple of some people are starting to get it here. The change your estimates, double your estimates, and somebody else had another one. But I mean the guaranteed, that wasn't private. The guaranteed way to double your velocity is to double your estimates. So okay, everything was a 5-point, we'll make a 13-point. Good though, on Laura's question, and while we won't have it in the word cloud, I would love it if people would in chat just what is the most common metric you know for measuring agile teams, and go put that into the Zoom chat. And we'll just give a moment for people to talk about that.
Yeah, definitely velocity comes up a lot. It looks like cycle time is coming up, burn down is coming up.
Yep. Yeah, interesting. Velocity, customer sat, that's a good one. Yeah, we see velocity a lot. Predictability. So let's dive into all of this then. So why do we measure? Why do we measure in the first place? I'm going to use the same quote that I used in 2020 when we did that webinar, and that is, we're going to go to Lord Kelvin. It's like, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. And that is the reason to do measurements, not for punishment, not for saying if whether or not somebody should get a bonus or not. It's like, how can we improve? Measuring is done so that you have the data to be able to ask the right questions. For example, in 2020, when we're talking about responsible uses, and we're really talking about how leaders should use metrics and measurements, the question we want to encourage leaders to ask is, if they see metrics that are not going in the direction they expect, the first question they should reach for is, what can I do to help? Today, we're going to be talking more about the team level focus, though. And so for teams, what is that question? For teams, the primary question is aligned with the purpose of a retrospective. If you look at what is the purpose of a retrospective, it's about improving effectiveness. It's about improving quality. So and remember, the Agile Manifesto says at regular intervals, team reflects on how to become more effective. The Scrum Guide gives the purpose of increase your quality, increase your effectiveness. So the question that teams should be asking is, how can we be better? That is the purpose of metrics at the team level, is how can we be better? It's about continuous improvement. So then we get to, what should we measure? So I'm going to harken back to the 2020 presentation, and we'll talk about what are levers that we think about when we want to do measurements. There are 6 common levers that we think about at Applied Frameworks when we're looking at what do people want to measure and why. So the first one is value. Are we meeting customers' needs? It's a very important one, and we're actually going to come back to this again, make sure that we reinforce this at the end of this. Somebody made a comment about Demi writing, if you can't measure if you can't measure it, you can't manage it as a cost limit. That is correct. And I mean, Lord Kelvin did in a different time zone. That said, for a team, if you want a team to be able to reflect, a team needs data. Data usually comes from measurements. So the levers that we think about when we're measuring is the measures we should use. Sorry, let me get focused here a second. 6 measures we have here. Value is the first one.
What? Before you do, I'm just gonna interrupt for a second, because I forgot to let people know that we end up stopping looking at chat because it gets really confusing and hard for us to do that. But we love the Q&A button. So if you have questions that you want to make sure we filter into this webinar, stick them into the Q&A portion, and that way it's easier for me to keep track of making sure that we're answering questions, that we have enough time at the end to get to those. And it's hard for me to watch the chat at the same time. So if you want a question answered, put it in Q&A, and we'll make sure that we filter those into the conversation. All right, sorry, Joel, go ahead.
I'm gonna lean into the value of Scrum of focus, and I'm gonna try and get you the information you all actually came here for. So the 6 levers that we think about in measurement. One is value. Are we meeting customers' needs? The next lever is predictability, that ability to plan and deliver. We did what we said we were going to do. Then we have productivity, and that's the concept of getting more done in the same time or with the same resources. Quality, of course, quality is super important. I mean, Ford, quality is job one. A product is free from defects or issues. Then we have stability. Stability is a less tangible one, and yet no less important. It's the organization can maintain this pace indefinitely. Principle 8 of the Agile Manifesto talks about sustainable pace for the customer, the developer, and the business. And then finally, we have growth. Is the organization growing and learning? One of the things we have learned, especially in the last just 5 years, is that if an organization is not looking at how they're growing, how they're adapting, how things are changing around them, those organizations are going to cease to exist. Even before COVID, we had whole businesses that were getting set on their ears. taxi cab industries were upset by Uber and Lyft. Other industries were upset by new market entries. Then COVID comes along and we just upended all of our beliefs, all of our understandings, and organizations that were not looking about growing and learning have not thrived as much as those as other organizations. We want to look at this though. What's the team's focus? The team's focus is here in the middle: predictability, productivity, quality, and stability. This is where a team can focus on getting better themselves, and they can own these levers inside of the team. And that's what we're going to dive in and look into more in depth in this presentation. Working on getting my slides to work for me. All right. So how will we measure at the team level? How will we measure those 4 value levers of predictability, productivity, quality, and stability? Predictability, we're going to measure through the concept of plan to done. What did we plan? What did we get done in a given iteration, a given sprint? For productivity, we're going to be looking at cycle time. What is the time it took to get the work done? For quality, we're going to focus on escape defect rate, and we'll talk more about all of these in their own individual slides. And then for stability, we look to the happiness metric. So we're not measuring the output of the team, we're measuring the output of the team as a team itself. How is the team working together? Now, with that, I want to go back to the chatterfall we had in Zoom, and one of the big things that we saw in there again and again and again, over and over, was velocity. Remember, the goal we have here, the question we're asking is, how will we get better? If you want to know how we're going to get better as a team, say no to velocity. Velocity is not the answer. Velocity might work for Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics. Velocity is not what we want to use as a measure for a team. Is a team healthy? Is a team becoming more effective? Is a team's quality improving? Velocity is not going to tell you if your quality is improving. Velocity is not going to tell you if you're being effective. It'll only tell you if you're being efficient.
Well, one of the things, Joel, that I remember talking about as well with you is velocity is also one of those metrics that isn't super trustworthy because it's really easy to manipulate it in either intentionally or not intentionally. And it's something that doesn't help. It's easier for it to do more harm than good, especially given the fact that we have all these other metrics that are really impactful for teams. So the other way that you and I had talked about it before is if you have choices to make around what you want to measure, and you have some really solid choices that really help teams, that also makes it easier to say no to velocity because you have alternatives that are really, really powerful for the team to look at.
Right. And as smart people identified in the word cloud, one of the fastest ways to increase velocity is just to change your estimates. It's not actually changing the outcome. It's not even changing the output. It's just changing the numbers. What is velocity good for? We have a whole article on this. It's in the resources section at the end of this article. Velocity is really only good for 2 things. It's good to say how much work can we take on in a sprint, and sometimes it's useful for answering when we will be done. The primary thing when I teach certified Scrum Master classes that I teach my Scrum Masters is, look, velocity is really, really there for one thing: to help the team to decide how much work to take on in the next sprint. That's the purpose of velocity. It is a planning metric, not a health metric. It is a planning metric. All right, so now that we've said no to velocity, let's dive into these four metrics in a little bit more detail. So plan to done. So plan to done is a concept of key measure for predictability. How much planned work did the team do? In sprint planning, the team said we're going to do these 10 items. At sprint review, how many of those 10 items did they end up actually demonstrating? Plan to done is pretty much a simple exercise of measuring what did you say were you going to do versus what you actually deliver. Scaled Agile actually has plan to done built into the PI metrics, so you can start to see the predictability measure. Some tips and tricks around plan to done is make sure to capture it at sprint planning. you want to capture the starting metric at sprint planning, because things can change through a sprint. We know this. While a sprint shouldn't change and it should be fixed, and we've got the sprint goal, reality is things sometimes get added or removed from a sprint. We only care about what got added at sprint planning. If halfway through the sprint you add 5 things in and you get those 5 things done, those don't contribute to your plan to done because they were not part of planned work. Remember, this isn't about measuring output. This is about measuring predictability. How predictable are we at doing what we said we were going to do during the planning event? So to that effect, only planned work counts. Also, only done work counts. At the end of the sprint, if the work carries over, doesn't matter if it's like, oh, we only need 1 more day. If the work carries over into the next sprint, it's not done. Plan to done is, what did we plan in sprint planning or in iteration planning or in PI planning? And what did we actually get done at the end of that time box? The last one is, unfortunately, Agile tools do this poorly. I've been working with Jira, Azure DevOps for years. They don't really do this well. Jira, for example, can give you a plan to done, but if you add something into the middle of the sprint, it counts that as part of the plan to done. So be aware of that with the tools. The best way I've always found of this is literally just at the beginning of the sprint, write down how many items they said they would do, and at the end of the sprint, how many did they actually get done. Any thoughts on this one, Laura?
So say that again. So when you talk about items, are you talking about, for example, maybe there were 5 stories that we took on for this particular sprint? So we said we were going to finish 5 stories and we finished 5 stories. We said we're going to finish 5, we finished 4. Or are you actually looking at, like the story points as a way to do that? Like,
no, we don't look at story again. Yeah, because story points don't, I could get 90 story points done and deliver absolutely no value, because every story had 10 story points and we did 10 stories. And so 90 story points is great. I got 90 story points done and nothing actually got delivered because of how the work is broken up. So yeah, we are talking about stories, or if you're using Scrum terminology, product backlog items, that piece of value at the end. We're not talking about the individual tasks. We're talking about that actual story work, the value that you're going to deliver. And there's kind of a theme here that we'll connect to at the end. But remember, everything here has to connect back to value. If you're not delivering value, it doesn't matter how predictable you are if what you're delivering isn't valuable to your customer.
Mm-hmm.
And so a great an example I like to use is, imagine the team, simple math. I was an art major, so I like simple math. Team takes on 10 stories in sprint planning. In the middle of the sprint, the team gets 5 stories added in the middle of the sprint. At the end of the sprint, the team gets 10 stories done. However, 5 of those stories were the stories that were added in the middle of the sprint. The team's predictability, their plan to done score, is 50%, because only 5 stories from sprint planning actually got done. Even though they got 10 items done, their predictability score is only 50%.
Right. So that gets into, I think, where we're going next as you reveal some of the other metrics. Is that really what we're looking at, is kind of a systems approach to thinking about how the metrics can be used to help that team improve?
Right.
Right. If you just have one, it's probably insufficient, right?
Precisely. And a good point. And I realize I don't think I actually put a slide in that. So we'll talk about that and connect the dots on the system approach at the end of these 4. All right, so then we get to cycle time. Cycle time is how we measure productivity. Sorry, my notes are on a different document, and I'm trying to keep my notes in sync here. And it's your direct connection to your throughput. It is your output measure. It's how many widgets is the team delivering. However, what we do is, instead of looking at number of widgets, we look at the time it takes for those widgets to get done. So in software terms, really what this represents is represents the hands-on keyboard. And let's talk about the tricks, and we're going to go into a little bit to explain one of these areas. So the first is, unlike predictability, in cycle time, the digital tools work best. The actual place that I like is there are cycle time figures and everything, but the control charts in Jira and Azure DevOps are great because you can set them and they'll give you the average cycle time. You can also use the control chart to see outliers of stuff. Next trick is, remember, cycle time is not lead time. Let's take a look at a slide to make sure that we're all clear on this in the terminology. Lead time versus cycle time. We're going to look at a timeline here. We start all the way over on the left and we've got requests. Requests don't get, you might measure them as some other way, but they aren't measured. Basically, requests are what happens before lead time starts. When a request is accepted, that is when lead time starts. So lead time up here starts when a request is accepted. But accepted is like accepted into the portfolio backlog for safe, or it's been pulled into the product backlog and supports the product goal of that product backlog. Nothing's been done with it. It's in the backlog. Cycle time is when in progress starts. And this isn't when the sprint starts. It's we have taken on this work in a sprint. And on day 3 of the sprint, the very first task of this item was pulled to in progress. That's when cycle time starts. Cycle time ends and lead time ends when you have met the definition of done. So at cycle time, it's when the last task is pulled to done and the entire story is done. That's when cycle time ends. Lead time generally ends about then also. Although the one thing to remember about lead time is customer facing. It's when did the customer ask for something and when did the customer get something. So lead time might actually extend beyond the end of the sprint because you might not be delivering the feature to a customer right away. Just because some work is done at the end of the sprint doesn't mean it is immediately delivered. Lead time ends when it is delivered to the customer itself. Cycle time ends when the team says, we are done, we have finished. They've met the definition of done. So hopefully that will clarify on cycle time versus lead time. Does that make sense to you, Laura?
Yeah, so it sounds to me that, again, the relationship between these two things could be interesting for different reasons, right? If you have items that have really, really long lead times and really short cycle times, then you might just be thinking about what is that whole system in which you're gaining feedback from the customer to start understanding what you might want to build of value into the future, and then understanding that time between when the team is done with something and when it gets in the hands of the customer. So you might be thinking about customer research, or you might be thinking about DevOps or release times or those kinds of things, maybe even more of a marketing perspective, whereas cycle time really is all about what's totally in the team's scope of control. Is that
right?
At it?
Absolutely. And because here what we're doing is we're focusing on how can the team get better? How can the team improve its ability to make and meet commitments to deliver value? And so cycle time matters. The interesting thing is, in a lot of organizations I've gone into and I've looked at, it's like, oh, well, we need to get the team to deliver faster. And when we actually dig in, the cycle time of the team is actually, I worked with a place where they were having a horrible problem with long delivery times. And it was like, oh, let's make the teams go faster. Let's get the teams more effective. I dug in and the team cycle times were around 3 to 4 days, which is actually phenomenal. 3 to 4 days to finish a story is phenomenal. Turned out it was the lead time. It took 2 months to just figure out what they were going to build. And then once the team built it, it took another month to 6 weeks before it was released to production. Mm-hmm. So the feedback we gave to that organization is like, look, your teams are doing great. Let's fix your refinement process. Let's fix your CI/CD process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's why both of these metrics are interesting to look at. And again, I think what this webinar is focusing on is what can help the team because it's within the team scope of control. So this
precise, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what is in the team's scope of control? And cycle time is in the team's scope of control. All right, so let's finish out the other tips and tricks for cycle time is categorize your work. It's important here because a lot of times the team's going to be, you're doing story work, you're doing defect work, maybe, and different types of defect work, or technical enablers. If you're working in safe, you've got functional work, technical enablers. Try and sort them separately because it's going to matter. It's oh, well, we've got a cycle time of 3 days on our stories, but our defects have got a cycle time of 7 days. What's the reason for such a long cycle time on our defects? And our technical enablers, wow, the cycle time on those is just out of this world. So try and understand the different kinds of work that you are doing and categorize that kind of work. On the flip side of that, though, is non-sprint goal is tracked, make sure non-sprint goal work is tracked completely separately. If you got a scrum team and they're working on value work and you interrupt them and say, hey, we want you to go work on this thing over here that has nothing to do with the product goal they're working on, nothing to do with their focus, the cycle time on that doesn't matter. That is more about you're interrupting the team, and you want to track the interruptions, which is not something we're really talking about today. It's just make sure that those interruptions quite often will take a lot longer, and it can skew your cycle time if this interrupted work is included in the same cycle time as, say, the story cycle time. All right. So now let's move to escape defects, which means I have to advance my slides. So escape defects that's quality. Quality, of course, is very important. This measure tracks your overall quality, the connection to the customer, satisfaction, and the team. The lower the defect rate, generally the more satisfied the customer likely to be with the product. I worked on a product when I was at Veritas many years ago, and we shipped like 5 feature releases in a year, and every single feature the customer wanted, boom, we had it out, and it was awesome. And then we started losing customers in droves because we were so focused on the feature work that we didn't deal with quality, and the customer started having problems with the quality of the product. So quality is an important measure. From a team's perspective, again, let's look at what's in the team's control. And so we talk about this as escape defect. The idea here is, what are the number of problems that are found in the product once the team is done with it? Once the team has met definition of done. In some organizations, when the team meets definition of done, it's pretty much already in production. In other organizations, team meets definition of done, it can be 2-3 months before it's actually in production. Escape defect is anything that is found with any issue found after the team has hit definition of done. So we see the stuff of UAT and integration testing, and so many people, oh, don't worry, it'll get caught in UAT. The goal of a team, a good Scrum team, should be that when UAT happens, nobody finds anything. So that's the kind of concept of escape defect, is the minute the team lets go control of it, that's when we start measuring escape defects. So tips and tricks around this. There are no bugs in a sprint. So this one's a little bit of a head twist, especially when you're still really trying to have functional silos in a Scrum team. In the middle of a sprint, you've got a story and you're working on it. And that story's got 10 tasks. When you get to the test task, if the test person finds a problem, they don't file a bug. They turn to the developer and say, hey, this doesn't seem to be working right. And the developer goes, oh, you're right. And they just put another task on the board to finish the work. Until you meet definition of done, all you have is more work to do. No, there is no quality problem. The next is measure after the sprint end and once you're in production. If you are in a team where when you hit the end of the sprint, you don't immediately go to production, I recommend trying to find a way to measure both of those separately. In Jira, I recommend using bug and defect. Bug is anything after from when the sprint ends to when it goes live in production, and defect is anything that's found in production. It's important to be able to delineate that, because you want to know, well, did we find it internally, or was it found once it was in production? And that's a little bit of helping the team to understand how to get better and how to work on the system better. Code check-in policies can make this a lot easier. One of the challenges here is this is another one where the digital tools don't necessarily track well, because the problem is, okay, it's in production. How do we know what team it came back to? If you're using one of the code check-in procedures like Git or the equivalents in Azure DevOps and such, what you want to do is you want to encourage that every code commit has the Jira or Azure DevOps, your Agile Lifecycle Tool ID committed with it, so that when it's in production, you find the bug, you find the code, you look at the code commit, you can see, oh, this was committed by this person on this team, and so you can trace back to which team introduced the bug. And then finally, use this metric to tune your definition of done. Best way to affect escape defect rate is improve your definition of done. When an escape defect comes in, look at your definition of done and go, what do we need to change on this definition of done so that this escape defect never happens again? What thoughts, Laura?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I think the definition of done is another topic for another webinar about what are some of the good practices around a good definition of done. But there was one question that I'm wondering, this might be a good time to pose it. So David talks about having a CAB process for all releases. And again, releases are something that aren't, they can be, but are not often tied to a sprint, the end of a sprint. So would you think that the definition of done or being done with something is once the CAB has reviewed the release, like that wouldn't necessarily appear in a definition of done because that's around a sprint boundary, correct? Whereas the feature itself may not be done because it's not released to the customer or approved to the customer yet, but that's separate from definition of done inside a sprint. I wonder if you could talk to that a little bit.
Right. So quick little side on this. First off is, remember, definition of done, the definition of it is the quality measure work must meet for the product requirement. And that's not, I didn't quite say that as well as it was Ken, but for example, the example I like to give is the quality requirements for the SimCity Build It game that I have on my iPhone are completely different than the quality requirements for a pacemaker. So definition of done is first you got to say what level of quality are we looking at? And then your definition of done is, have we met that level of quality? Definition of done with escape defects is, has the team met its internal definition of done? So a team should have a definition of done of, at the end of the sprint, what is the quality measure we have? And that quality measure should always be a goal of, if somebody put this into production tomorrow, nothing would go wrong. Even if it's not going to go into production for 3 months, the team at the end of the sprint should be ready to say, we will stand behind this story, that if it goes into production live right now, nothing will go wrong.
So then maybe the distinction is, so the distinction between quality and value then is important, because it might be a perfectly designed piece of code or a feature that the customer never wanted and doesn't like in the first place. And those two things are separate. So what we're talking about purely is around, does it work as written, or is it, is the quality high enough, or are there problems? Are there bugs or defects with it?
Right.
Not whether the customer wants it, which is different. Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's where we bring in the concept of acceptance criteria. And generally, acceptance criteria is the measure of whether or not the customer finds this usable. Is this fast enough? Is it the right color? Does it have the right amount of storage? Those are things that say the customer will use it. I like to think of it kind of in a restaurant analogy. As a definition of done is will somebody complain? Waiter, there is a fly in my soup. Acceptance criteria is, will somebody compliment? That steak was cooked perfectly. That creme brulee had just the right amount of crust. Now, to David's question about the CAB, it does bring up the concept of, you might also want to be having a concept of an organizational level definition of done, or a release definition of done, of what's the quality we have before we push to production. And that also is important, because mostly because you've got multiple teams coming together, and the challenge is, if you got 5 or 6 teams all working and they've all got great definitions of done, they still have to integrate. And so what's that release level definition of done? It should never, that release level definition of done should never, ever, though, be used as a fallback for the team's level definition of done. Every individual working team should always strive that when they are done, they take their hands off the keyboard, they're ready to put it into production. Whether or not it goes to production, they are ready for it to go to production. And that's the concept of escape defect, is if you end the sprint, and then in 3 weeks UAT testing is done, and somebody finds a bug in your code, that is an escape defect. You did not meet your definition of done. It's discovered that you didn't successfully meet your definition of done. Mm-hmm. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the last one then. So the happiness metric, stability. This is what I call the team health metric. It creates awareness and puts the other 3 metrics into better context. And as Laura alluded to before, one of the things is, if you only measure one thing, it's really easy to game it. If you only measure velocity, it's easy to game it. And go back and watch our 2020 webinar. We give a great example of gaming the system. Health metric, it helps to put everything in perspective. When you have cycle time, productivity, escape defect, those all are self-supportive. If you crash your cycle time, you go from a 10-day cycle time to a 2-day cycle time, and you do it irresponsibly, usually your escape defect rate is going to rise. So they end up becoming self-correcting, because if you game one of the other two are probably going to show off. The advantage of the happiness metric is that it actually kind of takes a step back and looks at the whole and can tell you whether or not you maybe are moving in a direction that could cause them all to fail. So let's look at some tips here. Until safety exists, do this anonymously. Just having everybody, okay, everybody fist of 5, how happy were you with this sprint? You're going to probably get a lot of 5s. So if you're in person, Post-it notes, fold them in half, put them in the middle of the table. One of the ways I really love, a Scrum Master I taught years ago, started using Google Survey. And before the retrospective, basically, while sprint review was going on, he created a survey and he sent it out, and everybody anonymously put in their happiness score, and they reviewed that happiness score as the first thing they did in their retrospective. The next is to look for outliers, not just averages. Maybe the team's got an average happiness score of 4.25. However, consistently over the last 3 sprints, somebody has put in a happiness score of 1. Now, if it's not anonymous, you want to ask them. If it is anonymous, you use the retrospective and go, hey, so we've got a good happiness score here. However, there's some underlying tension, and not everybody's feeling that way. Can we feel comfortable about talking about this? And it gives you the ability to talk. So be aware of the outliers. And then last, as I've kind of alluded here, it is a leading metric. It's a leading metric because the direction that the happiness score is going, all the other metrics will quite often be following in that direction. And I have seen this before. The best example is you had this really great team, and they took 2 of the best people out of the team and put them on another team. And the happiness immediately dropped down. 2 sprints later, all of the other metrics started trending in the negative direction. So a happiness metric, if it's going up, there's a good chance the other metrics are going to improve. If it's crashing, though, that is, you got 1 or 2 sprints to maybe head off potential chaos in your team.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, because I think people have foresight into what isn't going well and what's about to happen. And so I think part of the happiness metric is reflective, but it's also predictive as a human being of like, okay, well, how do I believe I'm going to feel during the next sprint? And I think both of those get reflected in people's answers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's put this all together. What does that look like? This is an example from teams I actually worked with in the past, and this shows you some real data from these teams. So we see at this cycle time, the productivity. This team started out with a cycle time of over 12 days, 2-week sprints. That meant it took them more than a sprint to be able to get a story done on average. Over the course of several sprints, they moved down to a cycle time of about 3 or 4 days. That's awesome. Any cycle time under 5 is just phenomenally awesome, and it's great. Same thing with predictability. This team, on average, they really had been frustrating their product owner. They would take on 100 story points and only deliver 50 story points. They would take on a lot of work, and then it would just roll over from sprint to sprint to sprint. And that's predictability is something a product owner, the business, really care about. If you are regularly, if you say we will do 30 story points and you deliver 10 story points, that's a 30% predictability. If instead you say we're going to do 10 story points and we deliver 10 story points, that's 100% predictability. The product owner can take that to the bank much better than they can 30% predictability. With this team, literally, once I gave them visibility into their predictability, just getting visibility, seeing this chart, they went, oh, and as you can see, over the course of a few sprints, they shot from 50% up to 75%. And actually, they'd been bouncing around in the 25%. It just falls off the back of this scale. Escape defects, again, making it visible. They weren't aware really of how much was coming back and how they were fixing it. Because we started creating some traceability by working with the operations team and some traceability of defects that were found in production, they started to see, hey, what we're doing is causing problems and we're having to spend time fixing it. And then finally, team happiness. And this one is a good example here. Although you don't, it's not as much because these teams have been working really well. You can actually see a little bit of a dip here. We have the team dropped from 4.6 average to 3.5 average. Their cycle time bumped up. Their plan to done, their plan to done flattened out and dropped for just a little bit. There was a dip in their performance because those two people left the team. Now they were able to recover after that, but as you can see, even 2 sprints later, 3 sprints later, they still had not recovered to where they had been in overall happiness. And the trend on their plan to done flattened out.
Right. So if I look at this and think, okay, if these metrics are supposed to help the team improve, then I obviously didn't work with this team, but I would imagine maybe one thing that happened was when the team started looking at their productivity measures, the cycle time, and realized they were really high. They might have done things like, well, how are we actually what are the stories that we're taking on, and are they sized appropriately? And should we be employing some vertical story slicing techniques to make sure that the stories that we're bringing on are appropriate for the particular sprint we're on? So it might have shown them that, hey, you do have other things that you can do. And maybe that was one of the things that said, hey, if we were better with writing our stories and slicing our stories and then refining the backlog and then taking the right things on, we can actually improve cycle time that way. Is that how they used that particular metric, or what did they do?
Yes, in this team specific example, actually what the secret sauce turned out to be sprint planning. They had been doing what a lot of teams fall into doing, a sprint planning of just, here's the product owner's got the backlog. Okay, great. We'll take we can do the first 10 items, and sprint planning was done in 30 minutes. I worked with them and they started actually taking the time to task the workout, figure out what the individual tasks were, who was going to be working on what were the dependencies, because what they had found was that actually the cycle time happened because they were in the middle of sprints and suddenly the stories were falling apart because they didn't understand them yet. They hadn't figured out how they were going to actually build them, how the database person hadn't figured out how he was going to integrate with the business logics person. And so they were spending a lot of time in the sprint solving problems that by moving those into taking more time in sprint planning, they had less problems during the sprint.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then with escape defects, I'll just pop down to that one for a minute. Actually understanding, and I liked you pointed out earlier on where categorizing the nature of the escape defect is important. And so if you categorize the nature of it and you're starting to track them, then I guess, again, I could see this team looking at it going, okay, with this type of defect, we do have control over it. What are we going to do? And maybe within a sprint, they made some changes that made immediate impacts. But then I would also imagine there might be some escape defects where they realize it's actually, they have a dependency they haven't been managing, or they have something that's missing that might be a little bit outside their scope of control, and either it took longer or they had to defer it or they had to pull other people in to help them with it. But is that how they ended up using that particular one in order to improve?
Yeah, it is. And this team had the luxury, which I wish was more common, of at the end of the sprint, their stuff went to production. So for them, escape defects were found in production. What they found, though, was one of the challenges by digging into this was they had a procedure for pulling down a local version of the code to machines to do validation testing and everything. But the problem was that was taking so long and it was so overloaded that people were skipping that process. And the bugs were being found in production because the development environment wasn't mirroring production well. So they actually went out, the Scrum Master for this team actually went out to ops and worked on a procedure to speed up the ability to clone a snapshot of production for local testing. And once that happened, they were able to better test things before it went to production. And so production stopped being the test ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would imagine then that there's similar stories with the predictability one, but again, it's if our predictability is low and we want it to be higher, of course, that is the ultimate sign, I think, of trust between the business and the technology teams, is when the business just knows that what the technology teams are saying will happens at the end of each sprint, right? That's right. Really a way to improve that relationship between the business and technology. But until you get there, right, there are things that I guess this team had to do in order to say, look, 50% isn't enough, right? We need to be improving this. What are some of the things what actions did they take on predictability?
The number one thing was just the advice I like to give is under commit and over deliver. And it kind of goes to the bad dad joke of, what do you call a freeway that it's at 100% capacity?
A parking lot?
A parking lot. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, really? That's it? I was just guessing.
Okay. No, that's it. It's not a very good bad. It's not a very good dad joke. I'm not sure how we classify that.
Yeah.
The idea is, it's like, look, they were constantly overcommitting. We've got 100-point velocity. Let's commit to 150 points. And I got them to flip this completely. And they got to the point where they were only committing to 70% of their potential capacity, which gave them reserve capacity to handle urgent defects that came in that had to be fixed right away.
Mm-hmm.
And it also allowed them some capacity to discover, oh, wow, this story is bigger than we thought. And it even allowed occasionally for the product owner to go, wow, I got this brand new thing that just came up. It is smoking hot. Could you take this into the sprint? And the team being able to go, yeah, we can. So they undercommit, and they constantly were over delivering. This team in particular was constantly pulling in 1 or 2 items from the product backlog because they were done with all of their work. The system was working well, and so they went and they pulled more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's that systems approach. So, if a team is only tracking velocity, then the connection between velocity and quality or building trust with a business or, even team happiness is tenuous at best, may not even be happening at all. And if you switch the view of metrics to something like a dashboard like this, they're all related, right? So at the end of the day, I think the idea is the customer is going to get something that's higher quality at the end of the day, and the business gets what's been promised.
Yep, absolutely. Which kind of brings us back to where we started, and that is.
So before you go there, I just want to comment on one other thing, where if you do pull in something into the sprint because you have time, unexpected time, that isn't a factor in plan to done, right? So right. So they are delivering more value than they predicted. But if your plan to done ratio is, well, let's say they're 100% all the time, are you then looking at, hey, maybe you guys aren't actually pulling enough in sprint planning? Like maybe your capacity is higher than you think it is.
Yep. So with all these metrics, you can have bad and you can have too good. I tend to tell a team, look, if your plan to done is regularly over 95%, either you're gaming the system or you are really not giving it your all. Mm-hmm. And so that's something to recognize. Same thing with cycle time. If you crash the cycle time too far, it may be that you've broken the work down into non-valuable chunks. It's like, oh yeah, our cycle time's a quarter of a day. Great. Are you delivering any actual value when you do that? So mm-hmm. You got to be careful about being too good as much as being too bad.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And again, that question helps us to take it to the caution. Output is good when it is connected to outcomes. So output metrics, all of these are out. Predictability, plan to done, escape defects. These are escape defects kind of on the edge, but they're output metrics. They're how much work did we get out? How many widgets did we make? Not does anybody care about the widget? And again, you can have the most rock solid, bug-free product, and it might never get used. In fact, Microsoft Bob, which was this version of Windows, was very, very technically stable. Just nobody ever used it. So if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Now you do have to be careful. That quote from Deming, this is the team needs to measure it. And the team measures it so the team itself can improve it. It's not management measuring it so the management can improve you. And again, please go and listen to our 2020 webinar on responsible uses of metrics for that. So output metrics allow a team to see how they're performing. And without outcome measures, you might get nothing. The highest quality and productivity does a little good if no one buys your product. So team metrics without a guiding value, an outcome metric, will lead to great teams, not necessarily great products. And that kind of goes into another area that Applied Frameworks is doing a lot of work around, and that is the profit stream. Couple of resources I've got in the resources slide is a webinar that our chief product owner, Carlton Nettleton, did, and also a blog that our founder, Luke Holman, wrote while at a startup, First Root, about the measuring impact. And so while you want the team to improve, make sure the team's improving with a goal. What is that value they're going to deliver?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, okay, so there's a bunch of, so before we get into a few more questions, we have, there's more than we can answer in the next 5 minutes, but one of the things that Joel is great at is we take all of the questions that we've definitely not answered during the webinar, and we include them in the follow-up emails. When we send the link out for the recording, it'll have more thoughts around some of the questions that have been asked. But I do think we have time for a couple in here. So let's see. Oh, here's a quick one. When you're measuring happiness, how do you do that? What are you actually measuring? What are you counting?
So on this one, there's a link in the resources here to the CRISP Happiness Index. This talks about it, and then this is actually the people that invented it. Heinrich Nieberg, who's two big things are product owner in a nutshell video, and also was the coach at Spotify when Spotify created the Spotify model. It's really simple. It's just I use a scale of 1 to 5. It's like how, and the big thing is it's asking the question correctly, and then also potentially asking the follow-up questions. What's making you happiest right now? What's making you least happy? What's one thing we could change to improve? So I recommend using the CRISP index 4 questions.
Okay, so when you're counting predictability, what are you counting?
Did we do what we said we would do in planning?
So it could be, we had these 8 stories and we finished 7.
Yeah.
Or is it, are you looking at the value of each one of the stories?
So again, these are output measures, because it's about how the team can get better. Remember, it's about how is the team being effective in delivery, and is the team delivering quality? Value is the responsibility of the product owner. The product owner is accountable for maximizing the value of the product resulting from the work of the team. The team is accountable for delivering usable increments of work. It's not their job to determine if that increment is valuable. It's up to the product owner to determine if the work is valuable. So planned and done is, did we deliver what we said we would? It's a team metric. The product owner then has to, the product owner is on the hook for assigning value and saying, how much value did we deliver?
All right, so you get to pick what you want to talk about next from the questions. One of the questions was a link to the 2020 webinar. I'm going to go ahead and put that into chat for everybody.
Okay.
So go ahead and
you want me to look at the questions?
I'll find the other one.
Okay. So I think we talked about velocity. Just say no to velocity. Let's see.
How about, oh, go ahead.
Okay, if a defect is detected 3 months after the team has reached the definition done, is that a metric of the current week? So yes, it's the escape defect is measured from when it was discovered. It doesn't matter when it was introduced, it's from when it was discovered. The one thing I will say here is, when you start tracking escape defects, if you can track it to the code commits, anything that was before you started tracking, don't bring it in. So if you started tracking escape defects on January 1st, and suddenly you find a bug from July of last year, that doesn't count, because it's before you were working on this. Hope that helps. Oh, hi, Ron. Hey, Ron. Given that you measure planned work, are you really measuring percentage of points versus percent of stories planned that were done at the end of the sprint? No, I don't generally. I used points while I was talking about the example, but generally with planned and done, I'm looking at work items. So how many product backlog items, how many user stories did you say you would do? I said I was going to do 10. I delivered 9. That's a 90% planned and done. I don't care how many story points they were. So thanks for catching me on that. Have you encountered accuracy issues with your control charts? I've encountered accuracy issues with every single Agile life cycle tool. But it's better than nothing. One of the big things is to make sure that you are filtering correctly, filtering by user story, filtering by the duration of the sprint. That being said, always suspect your data.
Well, let's see, 2 more minutes left. So there was one other one that I was hoping you would talk about. By the way, yeah, we're definitely going to send out the presentation and the deck.
And if you, in fact, like, follow, subscribe our YouTube channel, and you will know about all of our webinars whenever they come out. That's the fastest way to get to our webinars, is by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel.
Yeah, and then what you'll find there is we actually have, I guess, channels in the channel, right? So Joel talked about earlier about the evolution of what we're helping companies do from a product-led standpoint. So sort of like where our value streams going, especially for those SAFE folks in the audience, value streams are definitely part of implementing SAFE well. But I think when we start looking at metrics and what does a team need to get better, and then what does the whole system need to get better, and then how do we even think about value, that's really where the company is connecting all of the dots from team to, is the solution that we're building valuable to the customer, and then how do we track that value, right? So part of where we're going is ultimately at the end of the day, people need sustainably profitable solutions that are shipped to the customer. And in order to be sustainably profitable, there's certainly an understanding they have to be high quality and they have to meet the need of the customer, but they have to be architected in the right way. And the value exchange with the customer has to be the right one. And the price of this thing needs to be the right price. So Joel is already thinking about metrics from a systems perspective, and this is kind of that team-oriented one. But Joel, I know that you have plans for metrics beyond just the team, because we're always thinking about sustainably profitable solutions that get into the hands of the customer.
Yeah.
Right. So
and I think
you can see a whole metrics channel, right, from team all the way up to what do we mean when we're thinking about sustainably profitable software powered solutions, and those are the ones that are going to be really fun to do, Joel.
Absolutely. And I think we'll end with Rolando's question about lines of code generated as a KPI. Honestly, Rolando, the reason is because it's easy. We call these vanity metrics. Somebody mentioned vanity metrics early on. Velocity is easy to measure, therefore a lot of people use it. I could write 10,000 lines of code and all of it's useless. So how can you connect it to value? And also, can you figure out a way, are people gaming the system? I've heard of QA organizations where they got to deal with the developer, and the developer would write a bug, and the QA person would find it, and they would both get the bounty for finding the bug. So you've got to be very wary of vanity metrics. They're easy. It's kind of like the old Star Wars. It's the path of the dark side. It's easy to do, and that's why people do it.
All right. Well, I think we're at the end of our time. I appreciate all the questions. I know there's some that we would probably like to have talked about more. Some of the questions could be their own webinars, but we'll definitely be responding to these in the follow-up email that you'll all receive along with a link in the deck. And in the meantime, if you have any other questions, Joel, if you want to flip to that last slide, you'll see how you can get in touch with Joel. If you have things that you want to reach out to him on directly, connect with us on LinkedIn. And in that follow-up email, we'll give you the link to the YouTube channel as well. I think if you just Google Applied Frameworks in YouTube, you'll see our little logo pop up and you can find it. But I think there's a link we can send to you as well, so you can find it that way.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Laura.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for being here.
Yep. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.